Thank you so much, Maria. My name is Leah Green, and I work at the Resource Sharing Project. I'm the Rural Technical Assistance Specialist there, so I head up all of our rural-based projects. Prior to working at the Resource Sharing Project, I've been there about 7 years. But prior to that, I worked for 3 different advocacy programs around the state of Iowa, covering a lot of rural counties and having my own experience working at rural programs. And then also now working through the Resource Sharing Project on all of our rural-based projects, I really do have just the utter joy of getting to talk to rural programs all across the country. And it's really, I don't know, it's very exciting and interesting. Certainly, I know what rural Iowa is like quite well, but it has been really a very interesting part of my job to get to travel around the country and speak with so many programs where ruralness is defined in a really different way. I think it's sometimes kind of strange that we just sort of lump everything rural into one, because rural Alaska is really different than rural Colorado and rural Maine and rural Florida. Um, and but something that I think is true of all of those rural programs is that rural advocates are the most creative and like dedicated to their work. So I love that I get to talk to rural programs, and I'm really excited to talk to all of you today. Gina.
Amazing. Yeah, totally. Same. And so I'm Gina. I'm with the CICASA, the Rural and Indigenous Community Specialist. Um, and I'm so excited to get into this conversation as well. Before coming on and having kind of this focus in rural communities, which I'm loving that there's now like there's this kind of sector where this dynamic and this kind of community exists in terms of advocacy work and technical assistance. But that's what I also think is one of the most amazing things about advocacy is its evolution and its way of recognizing where there are gaps and trying to find some good ways to fill them up, where there are those needs that are pretty specific and rural can be. Before coming on to the team at CICASA, I was the program coordinator and tribal victim advocate for my tribe here in Colorado for a few years. And so yeah, it's really interesting you put it that way, Leah, in terms of rural, because tribal communities are rural, but there are also kind of other kind of layers and components to it. But what I think is similar along the lines of rural and tribal communities and why we're in this conversation together is around kind of some shared experiences, but also around like the innovation that is kind of necessarily what comes from working in these communities and folks really trying to work with what they have. And I think that's something we all share in together in terms of the dynamics that we find in trying to do rural services, and especially around advocacy and supporting survivors and victims. And so I'm going to go ahead and do a quick overview, Leah, from the first
Sure.
part. So in that first part, we really talked about the importance of training and orientation, kind of setting that foundation, because we know kind of what all of the characteristics are around rural programs. The short staff, the really slim funding, kind of very focused ways that grant funds can be used, and all of that, the lack of resources, the community dynamics as well, in those relationships. And so we kind of laid out that foundation of like, let's get grounded in what it is we're working with and in the realities of what we're working with. And a lot of the times we find that unless you seek out a specific funding that's going to address kind of what you're seeing in your community, you're probably struggling to make that picture fit into the community you're working in, and just kind of what sort of things kind of pop up out of that. So it really kind of just is an important call to us, really, really laying some importance and intention around training and orientation when we're doing our advocacy work in our communities and in rural areas.
Yeah, I feel like it's so key to sustainability is that training. And orientation piece, because I think we definitely heard it on the webinar last time, and it's certainly, I think, something, Gina, you and I both have experienced working at rural programs, is everything you just said, all the complications, all the barriers, the complex work that is asked of rural advocates. It's one of the reasons why at Resource Sharing Project, we've really chosen to kind of focus on rural advocacy services, because we feel like if you can strengthen sexual assault services in rural areas, if you can find ways to support programs, if you can work with rural programs and put together ideas and lists and creative ideas of what everyone is doing and circulate that to the field, those are real solutions to our movement, versus when you center the experiences of urban programs that have a lot more staff, resources, other community partnerships they can create, even sometimes just like easier fundraising opportunities just because of like higher population density. If you try to take the lessons learned from those and apply it to rural programs, like it's gonna fail, it's gonna fall apart. But if you can figure out how to create like amazing, strong sexual assault services in rural areas, like you can take those same lessons and themes and apply them to urban programs, and urban programs will thrive also. And so I feel like it's a reason why we've really chosen to highlight rural programs and rural work in our work at the Resource Sharing Project. But we also, we spent a lot of time talking about why it's so hard. And I think that one thing that we kind of all were able to kind of agree on the webinar last time was just how hard it is to keep staff because of all those barriers. And so I think training and orientation is a huge part of that sustaining services over time, because when you lose staff, you also lose, the trust of the community when advocates are there for 6 months and move on and can't get someone to stay for a really long time. You lose the trust of survivors that see that, in and out revolving door of people, and you lose the trust of the staff who are often survivors themselves. And so today we're going to talk about sort of continuing on with this sort of sustaining rural services, but talking about prioritizing services, because hopefully, you'll have done everything we did on the last webinar and it will be magic, and everything will be amazing at your program, and you'll have a very dedicated staff that will stay for years. But now, how do you decide what they're going to do, what services you're going to prioritize, what community members you're going to reach? Because I think it's a hard reality. It's almost a difficult thing to say in this webinar, but I think it's something we kind of have to name, that in our rural communities, we cover, most of the time, we're talking about covering pretty big geographic areas is often what is asked of rural programs, is not 1 or 2 counties, it's often many, and many different small communities throughout those many counties. And the reality is that like we don't currently have the funding to be able to serve every single sexual assault survivor that would benefit from our services in every community and every county in our service area, right? Like it feels really hard and gross to say that, but it's a reality. And so I think what we're going to spend a lot of today talking about is like how you prioritize the services you're going to provide for those community members and the people you're going to serve. Because if we're not making like intentional, calculated decisions, knowing our community and in collaboration with the survivors in our service area and our community members, then we're not making intentional decisions, and we're going to serve the people that are the easiest for us to serve, who are also often the folks that don't need our services quite as much. They're the folks that already have the privilege and the ability to be able to travel to our service area, to be able to access our services more easily. And so when we're making those unintentional decisions, we're going to end up serving a lot of people with a lot of privilege, and we're going to be leaving behind all the people that don't have as much privilege, that are more marginalized and are frankly even more desperately in need of our services than others. But I'm going to just acknowledge like many times how gross it feels to say that we're going to prioritize a certain service over another, or a certain population or community than another, because it's gross and we shouldn't have to. And every survivor in our community deserves to be served well by our programs, and our programs to have the capacity and the resources and the funding to serve those people well. But it's not a true reality right now. And so let's make smart decisions about this.
Yeah.
Okay, that's my like little pep talk to
Love it.
myself as much as all of you.
And I also want to throw in there too, Leah, you know, I think something that dual agencies struggle with too is when we're talking about what's easiest to kind of um, attain in terms of getting those services out. Domestic violence prioritizes also over sexual violence a lot of the time. And those things are kind of also connected to that training and orientation and thinking about sustainability around that, because domestic violence, again, another kind of uncomfortable thing to kind of uh, accept and admit to is, domestic violence and those dynamics. And that's not to at all minimize folks who do that work. I have so much respect for folks who focus on domestic violence. But it kind of seems like that's more of an attainable goal in terms of like the services rendered to folks versus like the sexual violence support that needs to happen, and is a lot more complex than what goes on with domestic violence in terms of what those needs look like for survivors. And so when we're talking about communities who aren't being serviced to the best of our abilities as agencies, I also want to make sure that we're holding space for that, for that for that reality too, that domestic violence seems to be a little bit more of an easier kind of service provision than the sexual violence parts.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really hard thing to name. It's, I think, often this dichotomy of tangible service versus intangible services. And so often when it comes to our domestic violence survivors, it's easier and usually within our capacity to be able to provide people with some tangible resources. So when a domestic violence survivor comes in and needing services, it's we're set up for that. We've created services for that. We know how to bring someone to the shelter and help them fill out protection orders and find food assistance and these tangible resources that, once again, I'm not knocking and are very necessary and needed. And also, I think there's there's a lot of rhetoric around that we are helping domestic violence survivors because if we don't help them, they will die. And that's a hard reality we all have to live with. But at the same time, sexual assault survivors who are often sometimes still need those tangible resources, but often also in addition need some of those intangible resources, kind of like what you were saying, Gina. They're also dying of suicide and self-harm and drug abuse and homelessness and a lot of other complex things that it's maybe not as easy for us to immediately connect to the sexual violence, but is factored in. And so we're going to start talking about prioritizing services. Where do you want to start, Gina?
Yeah, I think what's great is to start with this focus on healing. What does that mean? And thinking about that in terms of, the purpose of the work that we're doing, and looking at it through that lens of what does that mean to heal? Because of those complexities that exist in sexual violence survivors, it can be overwhelming. But what I find to be most helpful in our approach in our program was to look through that lens of the healing, which really helped center us around kind of an advocacy kind of basic foundation of like letting survivors lead. But when you center healing and what that means, not only does it like make sure you're falling in line with that, but it also really and not only gives that agency back to survivors, but it also helps us orient what types of services that we're thinking of when we're kind of internally kind of rummaging through like our mind files of like what resources are next, what types of support should I tap into while we're talking about this. Healing is a little bit more of an organic way of doing it, and then also in this way it's a little bit more kind of time and resource like efficient, because then you're not kind of like throwing this like blanket kind of response. You're working through this lens of healing kind of helps you really kind of connect well with the survivors, and that trust is built because this is all about kind of what that looks like, what that journey is going to look like for them. And so you're able to pinpoint kind of which ways to respond and what resources would be the most supportive in that moment or in the stages as you're going along. And I think that that helps because especially when we're talking about healing, that's important, I think, for us to think about that in terms of like what we've got to again give that agency back to the survivors, because sometimes we feel like in our agencies and in our work, probably because of our systems relationships we have, that navigating the criminal justice system is what it means to heal, because that's kind of like our grant boxes that we're checking off too. But not everyone, as we're learning, has the same experiences in navigating the criminal justice system. We know that the system doesn't work the same for everyone. And so that's the reason why I'm trying to emphasize this lens of healing versus wanting to apply what we feel would be justice, or what that pursuit of justice is supposed to look like, because then we start kind of orienting folks. We're starting to funnel them into the system. And we know a lot of the times that folks that we work with, that doesn't always work for them. And when we're talking about rural communities, it could be for many reasons, most of which have to do with interpersonal relationships we have with each other in the communities. So, you know, I think that lens helps us build community with each other, within ourselves. And I think that it puts us in a more kind of, in a way that's going to make sure that we're going to get to a more positive outcome that way, versus trying to decide for folks. Because I think sexual violence, we're quick to kind of, as like a knee-jerk reaction, is like, oh, we've got to call the police. This is just so outrageous that this has happened. And that's not to say that that's not the case, but again, just thinking about what does the survivor feel is going to be best for them. They probably have had experience with law enforcement, with the systems, many reasons why. And as we start to talk about intersections and who we're talking about in our communities and their identities and how they intersect and things like that, becomes more and more difficult for us to kind of find their fitting into this, funneling them into the systems.
Yeah, Gina, I always love getting to talk to you, because I feel like I always learn a new phrase that I've needed, and now you filled it for me. So I really like the phrase mind files, because I feel like that's absolutely what we're doing when we're meeting with someone. We're like rummaging through everything we know. And I think what you were saying really fits for me there, because I feel like we are taught a lot about tangible resources, and a lot of that is around the criminal legal system. And so when someone is sitting in front of us and talking, it's really, we're only working from the mind files that are already in there, as opposed to the infinite amount of possibilities we could, in time research and navigate and explore with the person in front of us. But often those mind files that come forward are what we know about the criminal legal system. And so I think unintentionally, a lot where we go right to that sort of like, how can I help this person through the criminal legal system, because it's a thing I know how to do and I really want to help that person in front of me. So that's the pieces of this story I'm going to pick up and run with and offer options around and move forward with. And sometimes we leave behind the little breadcrumbs of other things that could also be healing, or could be the only healing thing for that particular person. I just want to say really quick, because I forgot to say kind of up at the top, that this is a conversation between Gina and I, but I want all of you to feel like you're part of it too. It's part of the reason we've sort of moved towards less slides, more conversations with each other, because I think it's way more interesting for Gina and I, just selfishly, but also I think it's more interesting for all of you. I think it's more engaging, and I want you to feel invited into the conversation. If you have questions, if you have pushback and you don't agree with what we're saying, like all of that is so welcome. So you can put it in the chat box, or if you're like, I don't even know how to begin to type all of this, like you can unmute yourself. We can away from a lens of seeing our work through the criminal legal system, and instead starting to see our work from this like umbrella idea of like, what is healing? Because I feel like that shift for me was so profound, because suddenly I could start to see my work as helping the person in front of me with whatever they could possibly find healing for them. And one of those things under this big umbrella could be navigating the criminal legal system. If that somehow does feel healing to them, then that's a thing I can do as part of helping them heal. But when I felt like kind of what was asked of me or what I was unintentionally taught or implicitly learned from my coworkers, or just, we might say we're here to help anybody do anything, but then when we look at the behaviors of our coworkers and our paperwork and the conversations we have at staff meetings and all these little cues that actually tell us our work is largely focused on helping folks navigate the criminal legal system, then it felt like that was the only thing I could do to help someone heal. And so when someone would come to me that was sexually abused as a child 40 years ago, and the statute of limitations has run up and there aren't resources within the criminal legal system, I and so many advocates that I've spoken with across the country, I don't know how to serve that person when that's the only lens of how I've seen the work to be, is I don't know how to help you to move forward. And that is hard for the survivor, and it's really hard for the employee. No one wants to feel like they don't know how to do their job or feel good at it. And so it's like detrimental for our own staff and our sustainability of our staff. And it's detrimental to the person in front of us that's working on that. But I will say that when this like concept shift was presented to me in my work over the years, I mean, the first question I really felt like I had was like, well, then what the heck is healing? Like, what is healing? Like, we're going to talk about this big umbrella, but like, great, I'm on board. You've sold me, but now what am I supposed to do? Because I worked for, I think it was the second organization I worked for in Iowa. And I find this to be true of a lot of organizations in some way, was we had a staff of 10 advocates, which was, I mean, enormous. That's a very large staff. And 9 of us were domestic violence advocates. And one person, her name was Nellie. She was the sexual assault advocate. And I don't think any of us understood what Nellie's job was. I did not know. I'm a sexual assault survivor, and I did not know what Nellie was doing in the room with survivors. It was a mystery. I was like, what is happening in there? I'm on board with it. I want to know. I want to do it. I want to help people heal, but I don't know where to start or what healing even can look like. And so I feel like I want to know from folks on the call and from Gina, can we have this conversation about like, what does then healing look like for survivors of sexual violence outside the criminal legal system? Because I think we all have a lot of resources and a lot of technical assistance given to us about how to help make the criminal legal system the most healing it can possibly be for survivors. There are many TA providers, there are millions of dollars from the federal government given to that arena. So I feel confident you are in good hands with those people. But let's focus the conversation on like, what then does healing look like outside of that? I can start, you can start, we can start wherever you want, but I just feel like that's like a mystery veil I want to like pull off of this, because I think that is how you start to see then what your services look like. Mm-hmm. Maybe I'll just take a pause in case others want to jump in, because I don't want to talk all over you. And then if there's a giant gap of silence and you're all sitting in front of your computers, like, please no one call on me. Like, we'll talk, I promise. Yeah, Jamie.
Okay, so when I work with sex assault survivors over the last few decades, what healing looks like is, the way I do it, looks a lot like whatever that person needs. So it is just literally a lot of space holding to allow them to feel whatever they want to feel, to talk about those things, to be able to hold space. And then what that looks like, I think the more important thing is, what that looks like for me is also the ability to take care of myself in ways that I can handle what is being thrown at me. And after doing this for 3 decades, that looks for me like I have my own coach, I have my own therapist, I have my own ways of knowing myself very well of when I need to tap out. And things like that. But I think what I love about that part of advocacy is being able to just meet the victim where they're at And a lot of times, for what I deal with, it's been in the past. And so they bottled it up for a long time. And so I get to be like, hey, any vibe is welcome. Like, you don't have to like be okay with it. You don't have to be happy or sad with it, and to know that healing isn't linear. So this is going to come up. Like, and there's going to be times you think you're just like a-okay. And 3 decades from now, like, I might see you again. So I have seen people I saw 20 years ago pop back up because their life transitioned in a way. And so now they have to deal with things that came back up. And it's also knowing, like, in my community, who are good supports for these people. So it's really knowing the providers within my own community and who I can reach out to for maybe some EMDR, and who I think would be a good fit for that client. And maybe there is some physical things that came up because maybe it was something that happened a year ago. They haven't been intimate with somebody since that happened. And now there is some physical discomfort. And so it's like, okay, who's the doctor I know? Because, we're past just saying exam and all that. Like, who's the doctor I know that I can do a soft handoff? I can go with them if needed, that I know is going to address those things in an appropriate manner. Who is somebody I can talk to if they're not comfortable with me about intimacy after trauma? What does that look like? And so it's really like knowing who in your community that you can create this great support and net for them. And then also, like, how do they talk to the people in their life about this? Because usually that's what's happening, is they want to, like, this happened to me years ago. My husband's wondering what this is. How do we do that? Right. And so we talk about, like, what are the different ways to talk about it? What are the different, and we role play it out. And, sometimes it's, a text message. Okay, I think I'm going to do this. Okay, you can do this, like, and did it work? Like, what can we, and sometimes it is them coming in and I'm talking to them and their loved one a little bit about that, or talking to their loved one about, like, what sex assault looks like in survivorship. And, I just feel like I get away from the binary of right or wrong. It's like, this is just what it is. And it doesn't have to look any way except the way that feels good to you. And that is how I advocate for my clients, because I've realized after so long that, like, I probably don't have all the answers on how they'll heal, but they do. They know themselves, and to empower them enough to be like, how do you deal with this? How do you want to deal with it? And sometimes it is just being like, this is a really shitty thing that happened to me, and that's all it is. And I can move on from that for now to, like, do this, and then we can come back and bite-sized piece it. But that's just how I've been doing it. And that seems to be, like, from what I hear from the people I work with, that works very well for them. And for
Love
me.
it. I feel like you're clearly the Nelly of your program. I love it. So much of what I heard from you is this shift in perspective from when I was doing domestic violence work. It's like, I'm going to get you this. I'm going to get you this. And what I hear from you is, like, slow down, and longer timelines, and relationships over time, and, like, exploration, like, these non-tangible things, these things we can't memorize or check off on a box, or, like, memorize a flow chart of what to do. It's being in space with someone over time, is a lot of what I heard. And then I tried to put in the chat box, like, things I was hearing, because I loved all of them.
Yeah. So it is. It's like, for me, I look at it and I come from, like, the trauma standpoint of, like, what does this look like? How long was this? Like, all of the things. And then in my head, I'm kind of like, after a while, I've done this a lot. I'm like, okay, like, I kind of know, like, somebody's going to be good for like about that 6-month mark. They're going to be thinking they're doing really good. So they're going to drop off doing the things that have helped them. And then at 9 months, they're going to tank out, and they're going to seek my help a lot at 9 months. And then it's going to come back. And then I know certain things in life, like, when your husband retires, retirement is I get a lot of clients back at retirement, because it's this shift, and it feels sometimes, even though often their spouse was not the person that sexually assaulted them, but now their spouse is in their space in ways that they weren't before. And that feels really violating, even though they don't mean it to be. So I see that come back up. And So I just kind of like do that. And I realized, like, because I'm also a survivor, I know how I felt, like how I go through. And so it's, it's like it's long. And I try to tell people, like, emergency services, like in this work, can look up to like 6 months, depending on what's going on, how much legal there's involved, how much drama, like, and then we have this like transitionary phase. And how long does that transitionary phase? And it kind of depends. But it can be like 2, 4 years, like kind of depending on what you're doing with the person, that you're kind of in and out of each other's lives, but you're always maintaining that communication. And then there's times, like I said, I don't see somebody except in the store, because it's rural, for 4 or 5 years. And then all of a sudden it's a midnight phone call to the hotline. Can I talk? Or it's a text, or it's, rural neighborhood, it's a Facebook, because everybody knows everybody. Can I come see you again? Or, hey, this came up for me. But it's always keeping that connection open, and knowing that regardless of whether they have, whatever has gone on in their life, that they can come back, that this isn't a one stop. I checked the box, you graduated, I don't ever see you again. We're here for you no matter what, whenever that needs to be. So that's kind of, yeah.
It's building a relationship with someone over time. I love that.
Yep.
That's exactly how I describe that.
Mm-hmm.
Gina, did you have thoughts you were going to say? I didn't want to talk over you.
Yeah, no, I do. Thank you for sharing that, Jamie. Such really great things pulled out of that. I do want to kind of shift a little bit into healing in terms of, culturally specific communities like the one I come from. It doesn't always work either, right? I think if you are looking for an example of grants wanting to make things fit into compartments and kind of make assumptions about what survivors need, I think you look no further than marginalized communities and culturally specific ones, and programming and how that looks, because even the things we had to work with didn't always fit everybody who came in. Though we might be a tribal community, that idea that we are also diverse, we are not a monolith, right, is really it really shows up in healing as well. So there was this big old emphasis when we first started rolling out programming around what healing should look like in terms of the grant language. And they were talking a lot about medicine bags. And if you grew up with that, you might have an idea of what that means, or what that entails, what's going to be involved in that. But what came up for us, and what I think is coming up in tribal communities, probably a lot of our communities, is this growing population of folks, kiddos, young people who are holding multiracial identities, multi-tribal identities. And all of those folks, all of those identities, and all of those heritages have very different ways of looking at healing and looking at what it means to, put together a medicine bag or a care package or a care bag, and what will consist of that in it. And it gets a little bit more because we're people, right? We're complicated. And so that was problematic for us, but also something that I was really glad that we were able to identify. So sometimes through struggling through these things, we're able to kind of be able to document, record, and hopefully inform to do better next time, which I think is also kind of a hard thing for us to admit to and kind of have to surrender to, is like a lot of this stuff, the documentation is such a headache, but like it really kind of helps inform so that we do better, so that, now we're sitting in these roles now where we can do this focus and hopefully continue to be doing better. And then healing, I think extending that to advocates, I think Jamie kind of hit on that a little bit. That also should extend to the advocates. It should also extend to the staff that's going to be so our program, we had a very small building. We had like 2 offices where they had like doors that would close, but for the most part, like there wasn't really a whole lot of privacy, but we made it work. But we also had to have like weekly staff meetings with each other. Even my administrative assistant, whose job was, just to keep track of all of, the administrative things and to, oh gosh, he keep me from losing my mind, right? And so he really didn't have like, he didn't really have that in-depth relationship building with folks, but I think we all do in that kind of a small setting, but like he wasn't really kind of direct into what the issues were that folks were coming in with. And though we still had to look out for him, we still had to look out for each other. Every piece of our prevention staff, though they had their own focuses, we all shared in this space together. And I loved how, and I like sharing this because I feel like there's something in Indigenous practices around healing and advocacy that I think we should definitely be advocating for more of a comeback into our work and to help inform our approaches, because I met with our elders, our community elders, and they talked about our building as like, think of it as a teepee. Think of it as that place where we come for healing and for ceremony and, to do medicine with each other. When something bad happens, you're supposed to be able to go into a sacred space where you can put these things down, and it's a place that can be trusted. But also everybody in there who's helping someone who walked in with a problem, they also have to cleanse themselves of this thing before they leave back to their home too. And so you all need to be, thinking about that when you're doing your work. You're helping people with something that's it's a lot of pain, but it's also a physical manifestation of trauma, and for us and how our beliefs work. So it's a real thing, and it will cling to everything. And I think it's very much found in what we understand now in vicarious trauma, when that's what they're referring to. And so you've got to look out for everybody. You got to look out for every corner of that building, and, to make sure that healing is not only intentional, but that it's not like that, but also that it's encompassing. It's not just, oh, well, you're the staff or you're the direct service provider, so this healing and this kind of space is reserved only for you. So that can look like, some time off, right? Like give folks that day off if they've just come off a really complicated call out, and all of that. So I did want to share that, because healing is a complicated thing, even when we're kind of we're given the responsibility of rolling that out in culturally specific programming. That it's just this organic thing that we just have to be mindful of and intentional of. And I love all the things that Jamie laid out, because that is very much what it is. I did kind of want to add on to like this part where she talked about knowing who's a good fit in their community. So like building that community network of folks. What I liked to do, and I don't know if it's like great or maybe not so great, was I liked to get feedback from survivors. I also like to do work ahead of time with these folks who I think might be a good fit, or who are I hear about from other partners. Oh, this is where people go, or maybe this is the only go-to, because again, we're talking about that lack of resources. So maybe there is only one place for folks to go for certain things. And I would go, do some work ahead of time and go introduce myself and talk about our program, talk about our staff, talk about, who they should anticipate hearing about from us, and things like that, kind of helping to lay that groundwork. Because again, for us, we wanted to open up options and pathways, and we didn't, as best we could, not limit folks in terms of what their healing was going to look like and what next steps they'd like to take. Because for our communities, for tribal communities and tribal sexual violence cases, it gets even more complex, the system. And so really having that community network of support and doing that groundwork ahead of time, it was so tremendously helpful to us. And it also kind of challenged that building of that resource partnership too, because folks don't want to hear that someone had a hard time or had a difficult time, or maybe didn't feel like they were seen or heard when they came to them for that resource. But again, I think it is all about that relationship building, because that isn't only just with you and the survivor, it's also with you and your partners and what those resources look like. Because all of this is that network of care, which we talk about a lot in our multi-tribal coalition. It's the basis for the work that we do, and when we come together, is really centering this concept of a network of care. And so understanding with each other that we all hold a piece of this net that we're hoping is going to help catch survivors so that they can be on their way, and hopefully we're not dropping too many of them. We know they are. But setting up that network in a meaningful and intentional way, building that relationship too, having that emphasis of importance that how folks are going to be treated not only matters to the survivor and their family, but it matters to us too, as the program that sent them there. You know, we have a responsibility because we sent them there. We said, this is a place to go for trust. You're trusting me. We did all this relationship building and trust building, and here's where you should go next. And for me, it was important for me to be able to say, this is the referral, but not just this paper, be on your way. But I talked to these folks. I know who they are. They know who I am. You know, go talk to them, see if they can help you with this part of your need. It was important for me to be able to say that wholeheartedly, knowing that I did my homework, that I was very sure, and that I would trust this place with even my needs. I'm also a survivor, but if that's someplace that I would go and I would feel safe. And then also remembering kind of positional power, like think about it in the setting of a survivor that might come in, not necessarily me specifically, but if that's someplace that felt comfortable, that sort of thing. So just kind of really looking at it through that way, and then building your resource partnership around that, like having some understanding with each other that this isn't about criticizing one another. This really is about this healing aspect that we're trying to center and focus on when we're doing our programming, or at least for the programming we're doing.
Yes, Gina, yes to everything. I loved that. And I think it's really important. You said so many things that I agreed with, but the one that really lingered with me was just talking about, as Jamie said, sort of the importance of making sure we care about staff. I think that's part of why we're talking about prioritizing services under this idea of sustainability, because if we are saying to our staff, like, go forth and serve every person in our community to the fullest extent they would like to be served in every possible setting, in every possible way, we're going to burn our staff out, even though that's what we want to give survivors. And so I think part of tailoring our services, or deciding where we're going to put our priorities, is how we also help make sure that we're not asking too much of our staff. Hannah, I had a feeling. Hannah.
Sorry, I couldn't find where the raise your hand button was, so I just did it.
You raised your physical hand and it worked.
Yeah, I liked what Gina said about, you know, going ahead of time and maybe talking to a partner or a service provider. I try to do that as much as I can, so I can sort of anticipate any like barriers that might come up when someone is seeking out that assistance from that person. And I think it just makes it, even if there are barriers that can't be like changed, we can think of different pathways to kind of go around them, and just let the survivor know what to expect, which is a huge part of it. And hopefully, you know, that'll just encourage them to continue on that path of healing, and not kind of like stop right there.
Yeah, I so agree. I think that, you know, something we have to deal with all the time as rural communities is our like lack of other service providers, or like you said, there might just be the one resource. And that's why I feel like this sort of area that I'm moving us towards is having this conversation about prioritizing intangible resources over tangible ones, because intangible ones are infinite, basically, but it's sort of saying to somebody like, here's this resource that I know you need, and it's the only one in driving distance, or it's the only one in our community. And I've heard from other survivors and community members that it's going to be an unsupported, you need a food bank, and it is the only food bank, so you need food, but it is an unsupportive space. It is transphobic, it is racist, it is unwelcoming to fat people, it is whatever it is that it's going to be like for you. And I'm going to warn you about that ahead of time. We're going to talk about it together. We're going to plan for it. You can call our helpline before you go in. You can call our helpline after you come out and just rant about how terrible of an experience it was. Like, we can't always create the best possible resources, even though that's what we're striving for. And what we would all love to do is create the most supportive possible resources for people. But the reality is that sometimes people have to access resources, law enforcement, etc., that is not supportive of us. And so how then do we create the most healing, supportive possible way for them to access those resources? Even if we don't have maybe the staff capacity to accompany someone, because as once again, we're sort of in this part of the conversation where we're talking about like, what are we going to prioritize? And a lot of rural programs prioritize like helpline services, phone services over physical accompaniment, even though once again, all survivors, I would love for us to be able to accompany them wherever they want to go. But if that's not within our staff capacity to go everywhere, how then do we use what is within our capacity to be as supportive as possible? Talk through who else could accompany you. Or there's another survivor I know in our services that also needs to access that resource. Can you go together? Can you talk to us afterwards and before? And hell, just put us on the phone while you're there the whole time if it makes you feel safer or more comfortable. Or can you bring a bracelet that we make together that's on your wrist that you're going to touch the whole time as a reminder that like we're with you, and it sucks you have to do this, but you need this thing, you know what I mean? Just talking through what some of those intangible supports are, because it's just the reality of our rural programs sometimes. So I love what you had to say, Hannah.
This is Aguila. And one of the things that I think is really, really also important to think about is that the community themselves, they sometimes have support groups and have things that we are really not aware of, and that can really, really take the place of these other agencies or partners that we traditionally have looked into it. I had experience and have heard of some communities in the rural areas where they really go outside the box. They had farm workers where they had groups and support groups that were related to they build this support network within the farm industry. So the group that they come in, they go into different seasons, different places. So they work together and they create that unity, and they become that support. They become that, they have people within that they will be willing to accompany that other person as long as that person is willing to share those things. Churches, and I mean, like you said, Leah, there's so many things that we have not think about it because we have been taught about all these systematic traditional ways of healing that have to do with the criminal justice system. So we don't think about outside the criminal justice system, things that are organically happen within the communities. So I think that would be something to think about it. I also wanted to uplift what Shauna Jackson shared before. That is really, really important to think the way that when we are advocating and working with survivors, that we're there as support, as partnership, being alongside, not necessarily that person who knows what healing is or what healing has to be. So being there and being that mirror whenever they're talking and saying, helping them process so they find their own way, not us finding the solutions for them.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's part of that intangible support that Leah's been talking about. And I think it's also a very beautiful part of survivorship, wherever folks are at in that process. But a really amazing component of that for me, I feel, is the resiliency and the innovation that comes from, creating what that support looks like for each other. And so an intangible way to support survivors is to encourage this building of community with one another, and just you know, just the same lines that Agata kind of outlined there is, you know, community is so very beautiful in that way that they're we're capable of creating very beautiful spaces and when needed. And I think that's also a beautiful part of rural communities, is that's where it's rooted from, is this attitude of like, we can build it. We can build it ourselves. There's something kind of really strong that's built into that history of what rural communities are usually kind of based out of. And so that's something I really love. And when they say like, you know, oh, that small town vibe kind of travels with you no matter where you go. I take so much pride in that, because I feel like that has gotten me through, you know, so many different kind of urban experiences I've had in my life is exactly that. I do come from a small town, and we do figure it out, and we are very resourceful in building relationships and things like that. And it can be tricky and takes a process. And also we know that it's necessary. And that's what we do as human beings, is we gravitate towards each other. And so with the right supports in place and the resources at the ready, yeah, you know, survivors can build their own community and should be encouraged to do so.
I agree. I mean, to me, the two things, because I get this question a lot. I mean, it happens all the time that rural programs reach out to me. They're like, we have a low capacity, but we feel like we're supposed to do all this laundry list of things we're supposed to do. Like, how do we manage? Or frankly, a lot of programs call because there, I don't know if this is true for Colorado, but there are a lot of states where there is not funding specifically set aside to serve every single county. And so there might be a program that serves like 6 counties, but like one county over from that, like there isn't a single program that's like assigned to serve that county. So it's just a county without services. And so programs will call me up and say like, we're the next closest to this county and we're like not funded to serve these people, but obviously we have a heart and we want to help them. Like, how do we navigate like what we're supposed to prioritize, because we don't have the resources or the capacity to be able to serve them? Like, what are we supposed to do? And so this question of like, how do we prioritize what to give people? I always land on these two answers that we keep kind of coming back to, which is, I think helplines are like the most badass service we can provide. Like, and I think we don't use them well currently. I think that we use them to have domestic violence survivors call for like emergency shelter. And we have people call the helpline and ask like, well, you know, this is a thing I'm dealing with. Can I talk about it? And then a significant portion of the programs that I've spoken to about this tell me that they sort of encourage the person to then like, we'll come in tomorrow, like Nellie, the sexual assault advocate, will be here tomorrow. Let's set you up an appointment with her. It's sort of like how we get people, we see it as a way to get people in person into services or to get them in person into shelter. And it's just this like means to do so, and not as a resource in and of itself. And I feel like helplines are this space where you can build relationships with people. You can offer emotional support. You can offer education. You can offer it to people in a space where they feel most comfortable or safe. It can be in their bed with the covers pulled up over their head with their favorite stuffed animal. It can be while they have their pets around them. It can be while they're calling your program when they're walking along their favorite hiking trail if they have service. You know what I mean? Like, it's, you can do it in a space that feels comfortable and safe and cozy to you. I think I can't remember if I said this in our last webinar or if it was a different webinar I had done in the last couple of weeks, but like during the pandemic, I switched to doing over the phone therapy instead of in-person therapy. And I love it. Oh my gosh. I get to be in my pajamas. I get to have my cats around me. I get to feel like I'm just talking to a friend on the phone instead of just like staring in the eyes of this beautiful woman named Susan. Like, I get to be in a space that feels good for me. But we don't see helplines like that, or the vast majority of like mainstream non-culturally specific programs do not see 24-hour phone lines that way. It is a mechanism to get you in person into services. And like, how radically cool would it be if we started to see our helpline as something where people could call whenever it is that they are having an anxious moment, need to talk something through, just left a therapy appointment that was really emotional, you know, writing a letter to their spouse talking about their sexual abuse, like just any time when things are coming up, and we encourage that. And that's what I encourage for those programs when I say, like, you want to serve the people in this county you're not really funded to serve. Like the bare minimum of what you can be doing, and it's a pretty good bare minimum in my opinion, is answer their phone, talk things through with them. You might not have the funding to be able to accompany them to a doctor's visit or to be able to go to a sexual assault exam. You might not have the literal money or capacity to do those things, but you're always going to have the capacity to answer the phone and to talk someone through with these intangible supports. And so this is something we really believe in and care about at the Resource Sharing Project. And so we created this rural toolkit that is just all the resources we've created for rural programs and all the resources that other people have created that we like love and we often refer other people to. And so I'm just going to put in the chat box, this is our toolkit, and there's 18 categories of sort of services and components of sexual assault services with a bunch of resources, recorded webinars, websites, all kinds of stuff. But one page on there is about support lines. And so we brought rural support lines together in person to a meeting to talk about, like, how are you creatively and expansively using your helpline? And so we created this document with just lots of quotes. It's not just from my brain, it's from just dozens of rural advocates from across the country, called Support Connection Healing Rural Helplines Today, and just sort of talking about, you know, how do you staff your helpline? What do you prioritize on your helpline? How do you serve people 24 hours? What do you call your helpline? Because a lot of people, you know, we talk about it as a crisis line or a 24-hour support line. And I think those things continue to reiterate this concept of call when you need shelter, call in an emergency, but otherwise that's all you should call it for. And so starting to shift this language, a lot of rural programs shifting this language to 24-hour phone line or helpline or crisis and support line. And so there's just a lot of really good stuff in there. And then this is a resource we created because a lot of people really liked it and they wanted to have these conversations in their own programs about how they use their helpline and how they want to use it and how they are using it and what it's like for people. And so we created this facilitated guide to help rural programs internally at a staff meeting or in a separate meeting, just like have conversations about how you currently use your helpline. And so like pillar one is like helplines, because we always have the capacity to answer the phone. And I think pillar two of like the most important resource is what you were just sharing, is community building, is helping people connect to others and build community. And I think we often prioritize sort of a support group model, partially because it's all we know, and partially because funders ask for it, but also I think because we get to count the numbers. If we have a group of 7 people that meet in a church basement and talk together, we get to write down every week we serve 7 people. But if we build community in a more organic way, it's harder, but it's still possible to count those, maybe not count specific numbers, but we can write into grant reports. We can have conversations with our funders about the incredible work we're doing by building connections and community with survivors, helping survivors know how to more lovingly and honestly communicate with the people they love about the experiences that they've had, connecting survivors to each other because you know that they would be like rad friends or are going through something similar. Sorry, my cat is breaking. Okay, no glass broke. Do you know what I mean? Like you can really think of community more expansively instead of this like checkmark box. And it is such a powerful thing. Like when you ask survivors, I've been doing a lot of interviews recently with adult survivors of child sexual abuse for another project I'm working on. And just over and over and over and over again, the number one answer to like what you've reached for, what you've tapped into, what has felt good to you has been building community around me, finding other people like me, having a space where I get to be with other people that understand my life experience or who I am or what I've been navigating with, people to ask for advice because they're in a different part of their healing than me. all of that I think is really, really important.
Yeah, I kind of wanted to lift up and do a shout out to Strong Hearts, who I remember when they first started. I met a couple of them, the executive director, at a conference in Palm Springs. They were just launching, and we were in their workshop, and there wasn't that many folks, and there wasn't a whole lot of buy-in around whether or not it was going to be an effective way to to address the issue of helplines in tribal communities, and that this was going to be specific to those communities. So such a kind of foreign concept to folks. And only now when we're having this discussion do I see kind of why folks were like, okay, it's hard pass on that workshop, like good luck with that. That really was what the attitude was. But I remember there, like I was in the front row, like this could be amazing, like this could be really cool. And then now we're like years out, and like they've added, they started out as a domestic violence only helpline. It was still a national one. They had limited office hours, but every one of those helplines were going to be answered by trained advocates that were Native. And so now they've included sexual violence. They've expanded their hours. They do text now, like so beautiful. And I think if we're looking for an amazing kind of example of that, the potential of our helplines, I think we look no further than Strong Hearts, quite honestly, because if there isn't any more of a difficult community to reach in terms of like, communication and things like that, it would be tribal communities. Of course, there's accessibility around there. Do you have, are you able to access a phone or things like that? But they've been doing so tremendously well. And I remember I had checked in a few years ago with them because they also keep a network there. They kind of keep a database there that's national, so that when survivors call in, they can connect them to whatever's local for them or whatever kind of makes sense for them. So I keep in touch with them because I update kind of what I know here out in the region of the Southwest Indian country, as it were. And what was reported to me from the ED at the time was the majority of the calls they were getting were from non-Native survivors, from folks who saw kind of their all of their outreach that they had out there. They were seeing more non-Native survivors, or hearing from non-Native survivors more than they were hearing from tribal communities. And so to me, like that really kind of connects with kind of what we're talking about here, Leah, and kind of what you're saying is like, exactly, like folks are just looking for someone to connect with. They're just looking for someone who, not just anyone either. Like if there could also be someone who's trained in like understanding kind of what I'm calling you for. It's not just a call to a friend. It needs to be a call to someone who knows what it means to hold that space, even if it is over the phone. And clearly it's effective because they're still going very strong now. And so I just wanted to lift that up because I think that it's not just a foreign concept anymore. I think we've all started to embrace it in our tribal communities as truly genius.
I think it's the best of our work. You know what I mean? It's that relationship building. It's that slower pace of trust building and rapport building and building of community. I mean, that's the other thing about building community is sometimes we're the community for survivors. Or, in my other project, and this is probably such a tangent I shouldn't even say, but like in our other project about adult survivors of child sexual abuse, like a lot of what we talk about is the complications that adult survivors of child sexual abuse navigate when they're trying to build relationships in adulthood, because so much of their experience of love, trust, boundaries, safe people has been impacted by the child sexual abuse, that a lot of them are relearning in adulthood what it means to have healthy, happy, safe relationships. And a lot of times that is practicing with advocates. So we can be that first step of community as they like dip their toe back into that kind of thing. But if you want to know more about that, I have a 12-part podcast you can listen to. We have about 18 minutes left, and I want to leave some time for some questions. But do we want to talk a little bit about focusing on marginalized communities? Because it's really important to me, and I don't want us to skip over it.
Yes. Yeah.
We've threaded a lot throughout. You've wonderfully threaded it throughout, but if we wanted to just maybe talk a little bit more. Sorry, you go.
Yeah. Yeah. No, definitely. You know, all the things, given all the things we just discussed. And we're talking about complexity, accessibility, all of the things, dynamics and rule. But now let's fold in, another piece, marginalized communities and our rural communities. So as if odds aren't stacked high enough, right? We have folks in our communities who have, have experiences that kind of, stack those odds against them. And so really thinking about what that focus looks like in your approach as an agency and in your programming, providing those services to the folks who are on kind of the outsides of the periphery when we're talking about who our target community is, and knowing that it does mean everybody. It's supposed to mean everybody. It should mean everybody. So when you're doing that work in your agency, prioritizing that, again, seeking that feedback, I think is especially important to hear that from the folks who are least seen, heard, and believed, which are folks who come from marginalized communities, in marginalized populations in our communities. And I think like that helps us do a more intentional approach to providing those services to folks who sit in those categories, because that focus has to be foundational. Like they can't just be like a second thought to what you're rolling out. Like, oh, here's this great helpline kind of process program that we're going to roll out. But do we have Spanish speakers? Do we have advocates who are going to reflect those marginalized communities? Because that's also a component of trust building. And then also have to throw in there, be careful when you do that of tokenizing. You can't just bring on one member of a marginalized community and think, oh, we're doing so amazing here and we're so diverse. Because again, folks are not a monolith. So you can't just think you've brought someone in and checked that box and now you're going to hit all of those important intentional efforts to see folks who are in large parts not seen. And when you think about like who's showing up when you're doing your grant reporting and all of that, it also shows in there. Why are you not seeing as many folks from the Latinx community? How come, why aren't you hearing from, the Asian community in your area? It probably has a lot to do with whether or not you're doing that focus or whether or not you're doing those things intentionally. Throwing up some pictures on social media of folks who look like they hold certain identities is not reflective of what's really happening in your agency and what survivors are going to experience when they get there. So I say that to say, please be very careful about kind of what you're marketing and outreaching out as the picture of what your agency looks like and what your services and your programming is going to involve when we're talking about really creating a space to honor folks who hold those identities.
Yeah, I mean, I just love Agatha trolling us in the comments, because there are those communities in every single rural area, often sometimes large communities. But I think it's what you said, it's about intention. And if you are working from this crisis-based model of like, we just have to do stuff, we have to get it done, we have to do it, we have to like meet all these requirements, and you never give yourself the space to pause and reflect and talk to your staff and talk to your community and take stock of what you're doing, you're going to make unintentional decisions that are going to leave out whole communities, because the stark reality is that the vast majority of advocacy programs in the country are run by white straight women, and the vast majority of the staff members are white straight women. And if that's who's making decisions, not intentional calculated, prioritizing decisions, then your privilege is going to show in a way that none of us want. I don't think anyone wants that, but it's just what happens when you're careless, or when you are so busy you don't pause and give yourself that time to reflect. There's another resource that I'm going to put in the chat that was created through the Sexual Assault Demonstration Initiative that is very large. It's 100 pages, but don't be scared. I think it's a truly, it's a very good way to sort of take some time. Don't do it in 2 days. Give yourself some breath, but like take stock of where your program is at. Who are you serving? Who do you have community connections with? What does it look like when you walk into your program? What artwork is hanging up? What does the outside of your building look like? What happens when someone calls the phone line and doesn't speak English? What is the response? Like just taking stock of that's why it's such a big, long document, is to take stock of every single aspect of your program and get sort of a bird's eye view of what other people are experiencing, because every single person in every single one of your programs wants so wholeheartedly to serve every survivor in their community well. I don't think anyone is sitting there like, how are we going to leave people out? But that's why we have to have this kind of bird's eye view and take a look at what our program is really, what's the output and what's the input of what we're doing. And then we can start to make some of these like calculated changes. We can talk about what our priorities have been and what we want them to be. And we can connect with community members and hear from community. We can hear from survivors and plug for the coalition. Once you kind of do this bird's eye view and you want to start doing planning, like CCASA would be an amazing organization to reach out to start to talk about, like, now that we know who we are, now that we've taken stock of this and we've got a sense of where we're at and what we have done, now we want to plan where we want to go and like hold our hand and do it alongside us. Reach out to sister programs around Colorado as accountability and support and other people navigating this, and reach out to your coalition for support as you sort of plan those next steps and those priorities, because you got to have priorities, because yeah, we've said it a lot. Okay.
I think it's also worth it to, again, to think very seriously and intentionally about building community relationships. Get out there in your community, and we did that grounding on the first part because it's also really important to ground yourself and come to some realities with your community about what your capacity is. Like, we truly are doing the best we can. We know we're not going to hit all the marks for everyone. So we're here to ask for help. Look for the community leaders from those marginalized communities that you have, once you've done that work that Leah is talking about, and you see where, oh man, we could probably do a better job, with this community or with this population. Who do we know who's a leader in that population or in that community that we could partner with and come to them and just be very, very humble. That humility is so it's so priceless. And the only thing that does is like strengthen the foundation for you to build upon. It really costs nothing to do that part, and is going to also necessarily and intrinsically fuel the sustainability, which is the goal for your agency, for your program, for your advocates, for you, right? So and for your community, this is an important resource. Of course they want you to last. Of course they need you to be around. So just really thinking about looking at building those community relationships as important and foundational as well. Again, not secondary, not like an additional thing you got to do. It's got to be front and center.
Beautiful words to end on. We have a little bit of time for questions, comments, conversation. I'd love to hear from all of you. Have you had to make hard priority decisions? Where have you landed? Do you have advice for your peers? Are you like, I hated every part of this and here's why? Please tell me.
Okay, Leah, I'll tell you.
No, from anyone but you, Agatha.
Hey, we only have good times together. One of the things I was going to say is that just please remember that when you're reaching out to those grassroots communities, those underserved communities, those leaders in those communities, just make sure that you remember that you need to be part of that and need to be be there with a heart and not go there just because you want to make a relationship and just because you're going to get something out of it. You got to give. You have to be part of it. You have to build that relationship and trust and say, this is something I want to learn from you and I want to share what I have and support those communities, right? Because otherwise, then we're just continuing the oppression of taking advantage of those leaders or those members, and they're not gonna want to collaborate. They're tired of that. They have seen it over and over and over. So please break that change, yeah. So I'll quiet down.
That was great.
Yeah, I especially would like to second that for our tribal communities. I mean, I think there's a lot of myth around what that means. I heard a lot of folks say, "Ooh, is it really as scary as they say it is at, after dark?" And I'm like, "At my home? What?" That sort of thing. So we really do have a lot of that to work on, because there are social things pre-COVID, of course. There are social things that go on in our tribal communities that are open to the public. Not all things, of course, but there are some things, there are some events and things like that we do as a community that it would be good to hear from and see folks who also are there to support our people in their worst of times, and in their greatest need. Sometimes they find their way to you because of that lack of resources we have in our communities. And so, yeah, don't be scared.
I'm just going to put one more thing in the chat box, which is by email address. So if you want to follow up on this conversation, if you have any questions about part 1 or part 2, if you want to talk more specifically about how to make some of these sort of service priority decisions for your specific program, for your specific community, I'm so happy to talk about that.
Yeah, that's all I was going to add in there too. Just
Perfect.
let us know. We're here.
Great. Well, since we do still have 5 more minutes, and so feel free to, if you're typing, if you're you want to raise your hand and you still want to say something, definitely take advantage of this time. And also, I wanted to see if there were other things, Leah and Gina, that you wanted to leave folks with at kind of wrapping up the second part of this 2-part series about providing rural services and making it sustainable.
I think that the thought I want to leave on is listen to your staff. I think that the folks doing direct service have the strongest grasp on usually what's going on in the community, what survivors are asking for, what their workload looks like, what their community partnerships are. And so if you're an executive director in a leadership position thinking about like, how do I prioritize, or how do I support my staff, or what do I look to, like, your staff is so smart and has so many opinions and they just and they deserve to be listened to, and they have a lot of thoughts about where to go and what people are asking for. And so I think it's just really helpful to have these kind of conversations as an entire staff. like assessment tool that the last one that I put in called Picturing Your Program, you know, don't fill that out as an executive director by yourself. Like, bring all staff members into that process, because you're going to get a lot of different perspectives of people that answer the helpline a lot, or people that are doing community presentations and talking to a lot of their community members, or people that are working in a shelter setting or with housing. You're going to get so many different kinds of answers. And the advocate that has just started there like 2 months ago sometimes has the most insightful observations than someone that's worked there for 20 years, because they're coming in with fresh eyes and are seeing things, and are often the one also that sort of hears what you are saying your program is like, and seeing what you're actually doing and how those things don't match each other. And so invite that person to feel safe in giving their feedback and their thoughts.
Yeah. And I would also like to remind folks to try to view those types of decisions and things like that, like Leah just outlined, in more of the vein of, this is what's going to sustain us. This is what's going to make us better. This isn't about failure as a leader, as an executive director, as advocates, as a program in our community. And that might feel that way a lot of the time, but this is really about how do we get better? How do we last longer? How do we stay stronger? And all of these things we've talked about, whether it be community, staffing, you know, how workload, training, orientation, all of those things directly impact the sustainability and the strength of a program in our rural communities, in all of our communities, but especially so in our rural communities.
Well, thank you both so much. I appreciate you both taking time out of your schedule this afternoon to share this amazing abundance of wisdom that you all did this afternoon, and certainly in the first part. With that being said, I do want to share that I will be sending a follow-up email here pretty soon that will include Leah's email address and Gina's email address. So you can reach out to them with any additional questions that you might have, or any support, just like Leah had mentioned. I will also be including there a survey that's helpful for us, but it's also helpful for our presenters to kind of know any additional information that you might be looking for and reaching out for. So please do fill that out when you get that email. We also are going to be having a webinar coming up on the 29th. So next week at 3 p.m. Denver Public Health, and particularly Public Health for Public Safety Leadership Team, are going to be presenting a topic on kind of to this thing that Leah and Gina talked about listening to survivors, listening to people. They've done a basically like a research study to see what folks in Colorado, what survivors in Colorado of all crimes are really looking for in this healing process. So that's called Public Health for Public Safety, a community movement to amplify voices, shift paradigms, and promote safety, health, and healing. So I highly, highly recommend that you all keep an eye out for that and attend that webinar coming up. Thank you all so much for being here. Thanks again to our presenters, Leah and Gina, for this information. We'll stick around for just a little while longer in case you wanted to chat a little bit more. But at this time, we'll go ahead and officially finish off the webinar, and have a great afternoon, everyone. Thanks again.